condition as really pitiable. How can there be morality and ethics or spirituality in such a pitiable condition of mind? These are made of stern stuff. Krishna was to convey to us that message of strength and fearlessness and that capacity to face the challenges of life from the second chapter onwards. The first chapter ends with this shloka, Evamukta Arjuna Sankhe Rathopasta Upavishat Visrujya Sacharam Chapam Shoka Samvikna Manasaha. Immersed in shoka means sorrow, Arjuna threw away his bows and arrows and sank in the chariot in the most critical condition of the battle when they were in the midst of two opposing armies. And he gave the ultimatum to Krishna, I am not going to fight this battle. To us it looks that Arjuna was very moral. He was moved by sentiments of love, compassion, non-violence. But these are all on the surface. Arjuna's physical condition, Arjuna's mental state can be well described in modern language as a real nervous breakdown. Ethics and morality cannot be associated with any nervous breakdown. There was something wrong in man's approach to the higher life as represented in Arjuna in the first chapter. But except Krishna, nobody else would have dared to challenge Arjuna's mind and give a deeper philosophy, a more comprehensive spirituality. That is the uniqueness of Krishna. When Arjuna sank in the chariot, saying, I shall not fight, Arjuna expected Krishna to appreciate him and to bless him. Well, Arjuna, you are fine. You spoke of non-violence. That's what is good in the world. You spoke of compassion. But strangely, Krishna did not respond to Arjuna as Arjuna had expected, as most of us would expect. But the originality of Krishna, the profundity of his philosophy, the strength of his message comes from the second and third verses of the second chapter. We begin the exposition of the Gita from the first verse of the second chapter. It is an exposition which has moved the hearts and minds of millions of people. The beauty of the Gita, its philosophical strength, has been inspiring in India people for thousands of years. But in the modern period, it has broken the bounds of mere India's geographical isolation. It has gone to inspire millions and millions of people in all parts of the world. Later commentators came and described the Gita in beautiful words. Shankaracharya, the greatest philosopher of India, who appeared in the 8th century, in his commentary on the Gita, describes this book as Samasta Vedartha Sara Sangraha Bhutam, the essence of all the Vedas, all the Upanishads, collected together in one single little book. That is the Gita. The essence of the Upanishads is the Gita. In the Gita itself, every chapter ends with a colophon, descriptive colophon. That's very inspiring. You get the real nature of the Gita through this colophon. Says the colophon, Iti Srimad Bhagavad Gita Su Upanishatsu Brahmavidyayam Yoga Shastre Shri Krishna Arjuna Samvade Dvitiyodhyaya, etc. This is a conversation between Shri Krishna and Arjuna. Then this is the Sri Bhagavad Gita. It is an Upanishad. It is itself a Shruti, a supremely divine book. Upanishatsu. It conveys the profound message of the Upanishads, namely Brahmavidya, the science of God. Not only the science of God, Yoga Shastre, the practical implications of that science of God. As we have in physical science, there is pure science, there is applied science. Similarly, in the field of spirituality, we have the pure spiritual message of the Upanishads, and we have the application of that message to various situations in human life. This wide application of the message of the Upanishads to life's varied expressions is the greatest work that Sri Krishna did for man throughout the history. This is something unique. Is it necessary for us to forsake this world, forsake our bodily concerns, go to the forest, contemplate and realize God? If that is so, how few can realize God? We shall remain worldly, stuck up in the world, at the most saluting the greatness of religion from a distance, as weak people salute the Mount Everest from a distance. This was the thought that arose in the minds of people in those days. It was at that time that Krishna appeared, an extraordinary figure, and he gave this profound practical spirituality, the message of a pure religion, intensely practical and yet universal, sucking in all humanity to make humanity realize its own true nature through this dialogue in the Gita with Arjuna. That is the greatness of the Bhagavad Gita. It takes religion to every aspect of human life. It bridges the gulf between life and religion, between the sacred and the secular, through its synoptic, universal vision of the one infinite reality behind the universe and behind man. Krishna brings to us a profound message of practical spirituality. And the name of this message is unique, a beautiful two-lettered word in Sanskrit known as yoga. The philosophy of the Gita is just yoga. But yoga has been understood as taught to us in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and several other books. Yoga of the Gita is not like any one of these. They are meant for specialists. They need particular situations to practice them. But the yoga goes to everyone, to the student who is studying, to the lawyer in his office, the administrator in the secretariats, politicians, ministers, scientists, and the simple housewife. To everyone, through the work, through his social relationships, we realize our true nature. This kind of a message is unique even in India. That is why Sri Krishna gives in the Gita a supremely original message of practical spirituality. We call it practical Vedanta. Vedanta is the message of the Upanishads. Its practical implication is given to us by the Gita in these 700 verses of this great book, divided into 18 chapters. Shankaracharya tells us in his introduction to the Gita that the message that Krishna whispered to Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra was taken up by Krishna's disciple, that great philosopher and cultural leader of ancient India by name Vyasa, who composed this message in 700 verses and introduced it in the midst of his own great epic, the Mahabharata. That is how the Gita has come to us. None of the great teachers in India believe that all the shlokas as you find in the Gita were literally spoken by Krishna and Arjuna, whereas orthodox tradition through Shankaracharya tells us that it was a message that was given, which was put into a philosophical poem of 700 verses by Vyasa and introduced it into the Mahabharata. That is the beauty of the Bhagavad Gita. It is a smriti, a later work in appearance. It is a shruti, an original spiritual message like the Upanishads in its internal structure and internal teaching. That is how the Gita has been venerated for all these thousands of years. It was unknown to people till the 8th century AD, known only to ascetics, devotees, etc., etc. Its special importance was brought out by Shankaracharya in the 8th century AD by writing his great commentary on this book and placing it before the people as a book of practical spirituality. Since then, several people have written commentaries. Many Indian leaders have written commentaries. In the modern period, it has been translated into many languages in all parts of the world. In India itself, it was first translated into the English language by Sir Charles Wilkins, and published by India's first Governor General, namely Warren Hastings. And he wrote an introduction to that English translation published in the end of the 18th century. There is one sentence in that introduction which has special relevance today, for he said that long after the British Empire shall have ceased to exist in India and the sources of its wealth and power are lost to remembrance, books such as the Gita will continue to inspire millions and millions of men. That's what we see. The empire founded by Warren Hastings in India ceased to exist 31 years ago. But the empire of the Gita is expanding day by day, year by year.